Imagine it's 2019. You're a 54-year-old engineer in Munich. You've done everything correctly. For 30 years, you saved 15% of every paycheck. You didn't speculate, you didn't gamble, you put your money in safe German government bonds and conservative savings accounts, just like your father taught you. You check your retirement projections that evening. The number hasn't moved in 3 years. Actually, that's not quite true. It's moved, backwards. Adjusted for inflation, you have less purchasing power than you did in 2014, despite saving continuously. Meanwhile, your neighbor, who bought a small apartment in 2010 using borrowed money he could barely afford, has watched his net worth triple. He took risks. You were prudent. He's wealthy now. You're treading water. You don't feel angry. You feel confused. You did what the system told you to do. You were the responsible one. What you don't realize is that you are the cost. You are what stable systems consume. This script is about a word that gets used constantly but is almost never examined. Stability. Central bankers promise it. Politicians campaign on it. Markets are valued by it. Entire economic frameworks are built around delivering it. But here's what nobody explains clearly. Stability is not a natural state. It is manufactured. And manufacturing it requires fuel. That fuel is extracted from somewhere. From someone. What you're about to understand is the mechanism that extracts it, the historical pattern that proves it, and the mathematical inevitability that makes it unsustainable. This isn't theory. It's documented history. Once you see who pays for stability, you'll understand why every artificially stable system eventually shatters. When economists and policymakers use the word stability, most people hear safety. They hear predictability. They imagine a world where prices stay consistent, where jobs remain secure, where the value of money is preserved. This is the promise. The Federal Reserve's dual mandate includes price stability. The European Central Bank lists it as its primary objective. The Bank of Japan has spent 3 decades pursuing it. And to be fair, some forms of stability are genuinely beneficial. Nobody wants hyperinflation. Nobody benefits from bank runs. Chaos serves almost no one. But there is a profound difference between organic stability and enforced stability. Organic stability emerges from balanced systems, from markets clearing at real prices, from savings matching investment, from supply meeting demand. It's the stability of a forest that occasionally burns, but regenerates stronger. Enforced stability is different. It's the stability of a dam holding back water that continues to rise. It requires constant intervention, constant suppression, constant transfer of costs from the visible present to the invisible future, or from one group to another. This is where the hidden cost begins. Let me explain how modern stability is actually produced. Since the abandonment of the gold standard in 1971, central banks have operated with a fundamental new power. They can create money without constraint. Not unlimited power, but power without the automatic check that commodity backing once provided. This power is used primarily to smooth volatility. When markets fall too fast, liquidity is injected. When credit freezes, emergency facilities appear. When assets threaten to crash, purchases are made. The tool most commonly used is interest rate manipulation. When an economy slows, rates are cut. Lower rates encourage borrowing, discourage saving, and push asset prices higher. This stimulates activity. This creates the appearance of recovery. This is framed as success. But consider the mechanism more carefully. Lower interest rates transfer wealth from savers to borrowers. They transfer wealth from the future to the present. They transfer wealth from those holding cash to those holding assets. This is not a side effect. This is the mechanism. A 2019 study by the European Central Bank itself found that a decade of near zero rates had produced a cumulative transfer of approximately 2.5 trillion euros from Eurozone savers to Eurozone debtors. 2.5 trillion euros. Transferred, not created. Transferred. The German engineer didn't lose his retirement savings to bad investments. He lost them to policy, to the deliberate decision to suppress the return on safe assets in order to maintain systemic stability. He was the fuel. To understand where this leads, we study Japan, not because Japan is unique, but because Japan got there first. In December 1989, the Nikkei 225 reached 38,115. Japanese real estate was valued so highly that the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California. This was the peak of one of history's great asset bubbles. What followed was not a crash in the American sense. It was something stranger, a managed deflation, a controlled suppression of the adjustment. Japanese authorities made a decision. They would not allow the system to clear. They would not allow the banks to fail. They would not allow the recession to fully express itself. They would manage stability. For the next 3 decades, the Bank of Japan deployed nearly every tool that would later become standard elsewhere. Zero interest rate policy began in 1999. Quantitative easing began in 2001. Negative interest rates arrived in 2016. The central bank now owns over 7% of the entire Japanese stock market through ETF purchases. It owns nearly half of all outstanding government bonds. The result? Stability, of a kind. Japan has not had a financial crisis since 1990. No major bank failures, no currency collapse, no hyperinflation. By the metrics of crisis avoidance, the policy worked. But examine what was consumed. A generation of Japanese savers earned near zero returns on their deposits for 30 years. Japanese wages, adjusted for inflation, are roughly where they were in 1995. Japanese households delayed family formation. Birth rates collapsed to levels that guarantee population decline. Young Japanese workers faced permanent competition from zombie companies kept alive by cheap credit, companies that should have failed, that would have failed, that occupied space in the economy without generating real productivity. The stability was real. The cost was distributed across an entire generation. It was paid in wages not earned, in families not formed, in innovation not pursued, in retirements that didn't compound. Japan did not avoid the recession. Japan converted it into 30 years of stagnation and demographic decline. The volatility was not eliminated. It was transformed into slow, invisible erosion. There is a term for this mechanism. It's called financial repression. The phrase was coined by economists Edward Shaw and Ronald McKinnon in 1973. It describes a set of policies that allow governments to borrow at artificially low rates by suppressing the returns available to savers. It's not new. It was used extensively after World War II. In 1945, the United States faced a debt-to-GDP ratio of approximately 120%. This was war debt. It was necessary debt, but it was mathematically challenging to repay through ordinary taxation. The solution was simple and effective. Interest rates were capped. The Federal Reserve maintained rates below the rate of inflation for most of the 1945-1980 period. Savers earned nominal returns, but real returns, adjusted for inflation, were negative. What this accomplished was remarkable. Debt that seemed crushing was gradually eroded. By 1980, the debt-to-GDP ratio had fallen to roughly 30%, not because the debt was paid off, but because inflation and growth, combined with suppressed rates, made the debt shrink relative to the economy. But someone paid for this. Anyone holding government bonds during this period was slowly liquidated. Their purchasing power was transferred to the government. It was a tax. It just wasn't called one. This is the pattern that's now been deployed globally since 2008. Rates held below inflation. Real returns on safe assets pushed negative. Sovereign debt gradually devalued in real terms. Between 2008 and 2021, this mechanism transferred an estimated $4 to $5 trillion from American savers to American debtors. During the same period, asset prices, homes, stocks, private equity rose dramatically. Those who owned assets before 2008 benefited. Those who were saving to buy assets found the goalposts moving. This is not a failure of the system. This is the system. To understand any system, ask who benefits and who pays. The primary beneficiaries of artificial stability are holders of existing assets. When volatility is suppressed and interest rates are kept low, asset prices are supported. Stock multiples expand. Real estate becomes more expensive. Existing holders benefit. Those trying to accumulate are forced to pay higher prices or take greater risks. Debtors, especially large debtors. The largest debtor in most modern economies is the sovereign government. Low rates reduce interest payments. Inflation reduces the real value of existing debt. This is why governments have an inherent incentive to support policies that generate moderate inflation and low rates. It solves their fiscal problem invisibly. Large financial institutions. The too big to fail doctrine means that stability policies disproportionately protect major banks. When crises occur, large institutions are rescued because their failure would be destabilizing. Small institutions fail, large ones are absorbed or bailed out. The result is concentration. Incumbent political structures. Volatility creates political change. Recessions generate electoral consequences. By suppressing volatility, stability policies protect incumbents. The politician in office when a crisis is deferred gets credit. The politician in office when the deferred crisis finally arrives takes the blame. The incentive is always to defer. The cost is distributed more diffusely. It falls on savers. Anyone holding cash or cash equivalents in an environment of negative real rates is experiencing slow confiscation. Their money purchases less each year. Their interest earnings fail to compensate. They are funding the system, young people and future generations. Asset price inflation means each successive generation must pay more in real terms for housing, for education, for any asset that stores value. A home that cost 3 times median income in 1975 now costs 8 times median income. This is not natural appreciation. This is the direct result of credit expansion and rate suppression. Young people are not lazier than their parents. They face a mathematically different obstacle: workers in the productive economy. When zombie companies are kept alive by cheap credit, They continue employing resources, continuing competing, continuing to exist. But they're not productive. They pull down wages. They block new entrants. They create an economy that rewards survival over innovation. Wages stagnate. Productivity growth slows. This is measurable. U.S. productivity growth from 1947 to 1975 averaged 2.8% annually. From 2005 to 2019, it averaged 1.4%. Future crisis victims. Every intervention that suppresses volatility creates moral hazard. Market participants learn that risks will be socialized. They adjust behavior accordingly. They take more risk. They use more leverage. The eventual crisis, when it arrives, is larger than it would have been. The people who suffer that eventual crisis are subsidizing today's stability. The Eurozone offers a particularly clear case study. When 17 different economies adopted a single currency without a unified fiscal policy, they created a stability mechanism with no release valve. Previously, countries like Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain could devalue their currencies during economic stress. Their exports would become cheaper. Their debts, denominated in their own currencies, would become more manageable. The adjustment was painful but brief. The euro eliminated this option. When the 2008 crisis arrived, peripheral European countries faced a trap. They couldn't print money. They couldn't devalue. They couldn't allow their banking systems to fail without threatening the entire Eurozone project. They were locked in. The solution was enforced stability through austerity and bailouts. Greece received 289 billion euros in bailout funds between 2010 and 2018. In exchange, Greece implemented budget cuts and structural reforms so severe that GDP fell by 25%. Youth unemployment exceeded 50%. Hundreds of thousands of educated young Greeks emigrated. The stability of the euro was preserved. The cost was borne by a generation of Greeks who saw their prospects collapse, by Portuguese workers who accepted wage cuts, by Spanish families who lost homes, by Italian youth who faced unemployment rates above 40%. The system held. The people inside it were consumed. Here's where the mathematics become unavoidable. Once you've suppressed volatility for long enough, the accumulated imbalances become too large to unwind gradually. Consider the current situation. Global debt, public and private, now exceeds $300 trillion. That's roughly 350% of global GDP. Interest rates near zero are not an option anymore, they're a requirement. Raising rates to historically normal levels of 4 to 5% would make a significant portion of this debt unserviceable. Asset prices have been inflated by decades of cheap money. A normalization of rates would trigger repricing. Wealth that people believe they have in their homes, their retirement accounts, their pension funds, would be revealed as partially illusory. Zombie companies, perhaps 15-20% of listed companies in some developed economies, survive only because of cheap credit. Rate normalization would trigger a wave of bankruptcies. At this point, there are only three options. Option 1, allow the correction, let rates rise, let assets reprice, let zombie companies fail, accept a severe recession, probably a depression, accept the political consequences, accept that the people who were promised stability will experience exactly the volatility that was deferred. Option 2, continue suppressing. Keep rates low, accept higher inflation, continue transferring wealth from savers to debtors, watch inequality compound, watch housing become increasingly unaffordable, watch zombie companies accumulate, watch productivity stagnate, hope the system holds. Option 3, inflate away the imbalances, allow significant inflation. Nominally, asset prices hold. Nominally, debts are serviced. In real terms, everyone holding cash or bonds is liquidated. In real terms, wages fail to keep pace. The debt is resolved, but through confiscation that falls disproportionately on those who saved in the currency. None of these options are painless. That's the trap. The price of stability today is paid by someone tomorrow. When you defer the bill long enough, it becomes unpayable without severe disruption to someone. Every discussion of monetary instability eventually arrives at Weimar Germany, but the lesson is usually misunderstood. People remember the hyperinflation, the wheelbarrows of cash, the prices doubling daily. They draw the lesson that money printing leads to catastrophe, but they miss the sequence. Weimar Germany didn't print money because policymakers were ignorant. They printed money because they faced an impossible constraint. The Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations equivalent to roughly 250% of German GDP. These were payable in gold or foreign currency. Germany didn't have enough of either. The only domestic tool available was printing marks. To buy foreign currency to make payments, each round of printing weakened the mark. Each weakening made the next round of payments more expensive in mark terms. The feedback loop was inescapable. But here's the critical observation. Before the hyperinflation, there was an attempt at stability. In 1920 and 1921, Germany attempted austerity. Spending was cut. The budget was nearly balanced. The reward was a severe recession. Unemployment doubled. Political extremism grew. Faced with this, authorities reversed course. They chose inflation over austerity. They chose stability in the present over stability in the future. The hyperinflation that followed destroyed the currency, but it also transferred wealth on a massive scale. Anyone holding paper assets denominated in marks was wiped out. Anyone holding real assets, factories, land, commodities, survived. The middle class, who held their savings in banks and bonds and insurance policies, was annihilated. The industrial class, who held their wealth in productive assets, emerged relatively intact. The stability that authorities sought to preserve early on could not be maintained. The choice to defer adjustment made the eventual adjustment catastrophic, and the cost fell precisely on those least equipped to bear it. Let me step back and name the pattern. Throughout modern history, when authorities faced the choice between allowing a painful but manageable adjustment now or deferring that adjustment through intervention, they choose deferral. This is not because they're evil, it's because the incentives are structured that way. The politician who allows a recession loses the next election. The central banker who triggers a crash is blamed. The minister who allows bank failures faces a crisis. The costs of action are visible and immediate. The costs of inaction are diffuse and delayed. So they defer, they smooth, they stabilize, and with each deferral, the eventual adjustment grows larger. The imbalances compound, the fuel is consumed faster. The beneficiaries become more entrenched. The people paying the hidden cost become less able to bear the eventual visible cost. The United States deferred after 2008. Quantitative easing, zero rates, asset purchases. The recession was contained. The recovery was engineered. But household formation slowed. Wealth inequality accelerated. Productivity growth stalled. Home ownership among the young collapsed. These are not coincidences. These are the costs. Europe deferred after 2010. The Eurozone was preserved. The banks were saved. But Southern Europe experienced a lost decade. Youth immigration hollowed out communities. Political extremism grew. These are the costs. China deferred after 2015. When markets threatened to crash, authorities intervened massively. Shadow banking was contained, growth was maintained, but debt continued to climb. Real estate became increasingly unaffordable. Demographic challenges went unaddressed. Local government financing vehicles accumulated liabilities. The adjustment was not prevented, it was postponed. The costs will be paid. We now exist in a global system where the major economies are simultaneously committed to stability policies. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has expanded from roughly $900 billion in 2008 to over $8 trillion at its peak in 2022. The European Central Bank holds over 8 trillion euros in assets. The Bank of Japan holds assets equivalent to approximately 130% of Japanese GDP. This is unprecedented in scale and coordination. The result has been stability of a kind. No major developed economy has experienced a systemic financial collapse since 2008. No major currency has hyperinflated. No Great Depression has occurred. But examine what's been consumed. Global inequality has reached levels not seen since the 1920s. Home ownership among young adults in most developed economies has declined dramatically. Real wage growth has stagnated despite rising productivity. Birth rates have fallen below replacement in virtually every developed nation. Political polarization has intensified. Trust in institutions has collapsed. These are not separate phenomena. They are the distributed costs of stability. The engineer in Munich who opened this script, the young American who can't afford a home, the Greek graduate who emigrated to Germany, the Japanese salaryman whose wages haven't risen in 30 years, the French worker whose pension is being restructured. They are all paying, in different ways, at different rates, but they are all contributing to the same project, the preservation of a system that cannot be preserved indefinitely. Here is the irreversible constraint that governs this system. Debt cannot grow faster than the economy forever. This is not an opinion, it is arithmetic. If debt grows at 5% and GDP grows at 2%, debt to GDP rises every year, indefinitely, until it can't. The only ways to escape this dynamic are grow faster. This is the optimistic scenario, but productivity growth has been declining for decades. Demographics in developed economies are unfavorable. The tailwinds that drove post-war growth are not repeatable. Inflate faster. Allow inflation to erode the debt, but this requires that creditors accept losses in real terms. At some point, they demand higher rates to compensate. This conflicts with the need to keep rates low. It's unstable. Default. Restructure the debt. Impose losses explicitly. This requires political will that rarely exists until crisis forces it. Or simply stop. Let the system that cannot continue not continue. Accept the volatility that was deferred. Accept the adjustment that was postponed. Accept that stability was borrowed, not created. None of these paths are smooth. Each involves costs. The question is only who bears them and when. Let me leave you with a thought. Every civilization that has attempted to enforce permanent stability has failed, not because stability is wrong, but because enforced stability is artificial. It requires continuous intervention. It consumes resources. It accumulates imbalances. And eventually, the accumulated imbalances exceed the capacity to manage them. The Roman Empire debased its currency for 2 centuries before collapse. It was a stability mechanism. It worked until it didn't. The Bretton Woods system maintained fixed exchange rates for 27 years. It provided stability until the accumulated imbalances made it impossible, and Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. The Soviet Union enforced economic stability through central planning for 70 years. Prices didn't fluctuate. Unemployment didn't officially exist until 1991. The pattern is not subtle. What makes the current moment different is only the scale, the global coordination, the sophistication of the tools, the ability to defer longer and more completely than ever before. But the mathematics haven't changed. What cannot continue will not continue. The question isn't if the bill comes due. The question is who will be holding it when it arrives, and whether they will understand that they were always intended to hold it. The German engineer understood too late. He was never the beneficiary of stability. He was the cost of it. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial or investment advice. The patterns described here are offered for understanding, not prediction. Consult qualified professionals before making any financial decisions. This channel exists to conduct autopsies on systems before they're declared dead. If this analysis was useful to you, consider subscribing. Most people don't see these patterns until the bill arrives in their hands. The pattern is already in motion.